Thank you. I am Rich Ditizio, and on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Milken Institute, I would like to welcome you to the future of health. Yes. We conduct these sessions all around the world with the express intention of having our speakers and attendees really try to see things from a different perspective and broaden your horizons, maybe think of things that you hadn't before. We like to focus on the interconnectedness of things. How does one thing impact another? And beyond ordinary cause and effect or action-reaction, but can we try and foresee some of the unintended consequences that often started out as something quite positive, such as antibiotic resistance, or opioid addiction, or obesity, or any of the number of things that we're going to be discussing over the next couple of days. I like to think of problems as prismatic. They seem like they're hitting in a single beam, but then when you refract them into their various components, you can really conduct a much more robust analysis and understand what root causes might have led to the contributing factors, as well as some potential resolutions down the road. That's why at the Institute we have 8 distinct centers which try and take a holistic view of some of the challenges we're trying to tackle. So I'll give you an example. As you know, many organizations around the world were keenly focused on the eradication of infectious disease in Africa, primarily tuberculosis and malaria. When it came to malaria, one of the more effective methods is actually bed nets. So many organizations got together, and using their heft, they got the nets donated and distributed throughout the continent. But when you give someone a bed net, you're assuming 2 things. 1, that they have a bed, and 2, that they're going to sleep in it. And in fact, in many regions that receive these nets, either communities are too poor to have beds, or the social construct of that part of the world is that you sleep on the floor with your children. But being quite industrious, people took these nets and started fishing with them. Now, the challenge with that is that the tightness of the mesh which prevents a mosquito from biting you takes every fish out of the river. So now there are many rivers, the entire ecosystem of which has been changed. And now we have an environmental issue to deal with as opposed to the sickness we were trying to. So the unintended consequence of ecological change from the very good intention of trying to cure a disease. And many of you have spent your life's work trying to cure disease. And all of that work has equated into a longevity dividend, allowing people to live longer, healthier lives, which is an amazing thing, except if you're a money manager managing a pension fund. And as we do these events around the world and we travel and we convene these managers of these money, so the challenge of having a life expectancy that far exceeds what was expected when these retirement schemes were formed, and then compounding that, if you're managing this money in a part of the world that has been wrestling with 0 or negative interest rates and you're missing your return hurdles, you've really exacerbated the problem. So what I would encourage you to do as we begin our sessions with this evening's is try to listen with a different ear. You all know what you do so well in your day job, but try and think, can I apply that expertise towards anticipating some consequence I wasn't thinking about before as we go through the program over the next couple of days. So with that, we've prepared a short video for you to kick the evening off, and I'd like to cue that now.
The purpose of this motion picture is to give you the facts, and then you, as individuals and citizens of a democracy, must take action.
Every year in America, there are more than 100,000 new cases of tuberculosis.
Parents lived in fear of polio's sudden attack.
Frequent illness followed the eating of food which was tainted, unfit for human consumption.
Finally, April 12, 1955, Salk vaccine, safe, effective. Millions of boys and girls across the nation protected against paralytic polio.
Discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928 and the subsequent development of antibiotics has revolutionized the treatment of infectious diseases.
But their misuse and overuse is having dangerous consequences.
500,000 Americans have died in the last 15 years from an overdose, and the majority of those involve opioids.
Obesity is epidemic in the United States and a major cause of death attributable to heart disease, cancer, and diabetes.
An extremely deadly type of antibiotic-resistant bacteria has been traced to a food product.
Missing her vaccination dates.
We're not vaccinating.
Our measles vaccination rate is 91%, lower than half of the countries in the world.
2012 marks the worst year for whooping cough in Colorado since 1948.
The increasing interconnectedness of our world leaves us more vulnerable to the spread of contagions.
Second U.S. citizen has tested positive for the Ebola virus.
It's 1/1000th our size and it's beating us.
Google engineers will work with UNICEF to map the spread of Zika.
I'm fine. It's just a small bug bite.
The hope is to attack Zika where it is spreading.
We can effectively protect people against container breeding mosquitoes using new data-driven operational methods.
The smartphone may change personal medical care in ways none of us saw coming.
It's going to be devices that are monitoring the lives of millions of patients.
We took about 2 billion tweets, and the first thing we looked at was, can we use these tweets as a way of predicting how disease is going to spread in the United States?
If humanity plays its cards right, superbugs might turn out to be not very super after all.
Outbreak of Ebola virus disease is over.
What seems to be fantasy and sci-fi is actually just right around the corner.
The health of every citizen is important to the continued greatness of America.
So I think most of you know, over the 20+ years we've been putting on these events, we try to get you to know the other people at your table by giving you a quiz. I have the expert here sitting on my left. And so this gives you, we only give you 1 minute, but with so many experts on public health and other issues here, it shouldn't be a problem. So our first question tonight is, very simply, can we pull that up? Okay. Obesity is a known risk factor for high blood pressure. How many miles of added blood vessels does the heart have to pump through for each pound of excess weight? So this is miles for just 1 extra pound. Does it have to go 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7? Okay, time is up. Only 1 vote per table. 1 vote per table. So Dr. Francis Collins is manning his own table tonight and is not a lifeline for any. Thank you for joining us, Francis. Okay, how many think it's 3 extra miles per pound? Gosh, if you weigh 20 pounds, you think it's more than 600 miles, okay? How about B, 4 extra miles? No one's voting for that. You cannot win for your table if you don't vote. I want to just let you know. C, 5 extra miles. Okay, we have a few. Maybe 7. 6 extra miles. Okay. Multiple votes at one table. Okay, and E, 7 extra miles.
I'm with the 7 people.
The correct answer is... Okay. That was just a warm-up. Okay, you think you had a busy day today? Let's hear what Senator Booker had to do today. Tell us about your day.
Well, my day's been all over the place, from public schools in New Jersey all the way down to voting on the floor of the Senate. But the big thing that we did today is, after months and months and months of working with environmental justice advocates, not climate change folks, but folks that focus on the immediate urgent issues of environmental injustice in our country, we unveiled a pretty major piece of legislation to try to combat really conditions that most Americans, especially Americans that are privileged, really don't even think exist in the United States.
Give us a few examples of that, Senator.
So I left New Jersey, where I know a lot about the environmental injustice, and really traveled through the country. I've been to everywhere from Duplin County, North Carolina, and the hog farm areas, to Tallahassee, Alabama, to even St. Parish County and Parish, in Louisiana. And these are places that have things, really, I couldn't believe it, but you have environmental conditions that are so extreme where disproportionately where poor people live, and disproportionately on those poor people, disproportionately people of color, where you have types of corporate villainy that you just can't believe. Literally, in St. Parish, they call the area, the nickname for the area is Cancer Alley, because of all the petrochemical companies there, and the quality of air is many, many dozens of times worse beyond what EPA says is an advantage. And I did this because I became an environmental activist, not because of my concerns about climate change, not because of worries about polar ice caps. I was just living in an inner city. I'm the only senator that lives in an urban core. I live in an overwhelmingly majority Black and Latino community. The median income in my census tract is about $14,000. And just starting to work there as a young man coming out of law school, I was astonished that I came there to work on issues of housing and public safety, but I just never understood, I think, until I was living in some high-rise public housing projects, how urgent the environmental crises are, especially for poor communities. And just think about this, when I was mayor of Newark, I had already dealt with epidemic levels of asthma and lead poisoning. Most people think Flint is an anomaly, but there are over 3,000 communities in America where the children have twice the blood lead levels of Flint, Michigan. And in my community, was one of those communities with exorbitant blood lead levels, terrible air quality because all the highways intersect there. You have all these kind of public assets, one might think, from waste treatment areas to incinerators that burn trash, all in this area that's just driven up, as most urban areas do, multiple times the asthma rates. But then it started getting worse for me. I decided to try to deal with food deserts, which we were just talking about, by declaring that I was going to make Newark, New Jersey the biggest urban farming city in all of New Jersey. And I began to go out and we started planting in the soil, but the Environmental Protection Agency of our state said, stop what you're doing. You can't grow things in the soil here in this in the city because of the poisons in the soil. And so by the time I finished as mayor, just looking at my environment, I saw my kids couldn't breathe the air, it was toxic. Couldn't plant in the soil because it was toxic, and the water was toxic. Everything from children having to drink out of bottled waters in our schools because of the lead, or even the Passaic River, which poor people a century ago could go crabbing, fishing to try to sustain their families. Now it is literally a Superfund site. And these Superfund sites, which every state has, again, disproportionately poor communities, disproportionately communities of color, we know what it's doing to our children. Children who live within about a mile of a Superfund site, I live with 2 Superfund sites around me, have 20% higher levels of birth defects, significantly higher rates of autism. So here you have children growing up in communities where the environmental alienation, degradation, toxicity is so high, their rates of cancers, respiratory diseases, lead in their blood is so tragic, but we don't do anything about it as a country. So I wanted to go around and try to show folks that whether you live in rural areas like Alabama where I was, or urban areas like Newark, there is a common pain affecting tens of millions of Americans, but we're not doing anything about it. Just Superfunds is the most annoying, frustrating thing to me because we know the threat to our children. Ronald Reagan and Mitch McConnell voted on a method to fund the cleanup of Superfund sites, but we failed to reauthorize it in my generation as a senator. And what's happening to Superfund sites is they're actually increasing in our country and continuing to hurt and damage the lives of our children. So today, I unveiled a piece of legislation that will go at a lot of these core issues that are really unimaginable and indicative in many ways of the perversion of capitalism that we have, where companies are allowed to outsource their costs onto communities to the detriment of millions and internalize their profits by not dealing with the environmental injustices that they're laying upon towns.
Senator, I think we all appreciate you shining the light on this issue. Now, one of the things that many people in the audience don't know about you, I was thinking of some of them. So here's a boy from New Jersey that goes to school in Stanford.
I got in because of a 4.0, 1,600, 4.0 yards per carry, 1,600 receiving yards. I got a football scholarship.
Okay, now I moved about 1,200 people from the Northeast to California. Almost all of them stayed 25 years later. You came back to New Jersey. Why?
So I owe a lot to my state. When my father, who was born poor as a single kid in the South, really with no hope or opportunity, but it was the intervention of a lot of Americans that broke my father out of poverty, got him to college. Civil rights movement was happening at that time, and my parents benefited. My father was the first black person hired by IBM as a salesman in the entire Virginia area. And then when my parents went to move, my father got a promotion up to Manhattan, and my parents went to move into New Jersey. They wouldn't sell my parents homes in white neighborhoods. And so my parents had to get a grassroots organization, the Fair Housing Council, to send white couples out to pose as them. And then they found a house they loved. They were told it was sold. The white couple found it was still for sale. They put a bid on the house. The bid was accepted, papers drawn up. And on the day of the closing, my father and a volunteer lawyer from the organization named Marty Friedman confronted the real estate agent. And the real estate agent got angry, realizing he was caught in a trap, punched my dad's lawyer in the face, sigged a dog on my dad. Big fight broke out. And I always say that every time my dad would tell this story, the dog would get a lot bigger. But I'm now growing up in this incredibly privileged town that has great environment where I can plant tomatoes with my grandfather in the backyard and hear stories of a nation of struggle. But my parents always reminded me that we are here in this house because of this hard work, dedication, discipline of a family, but it was a larger community that enabled us to be where we are today, and that we owe a legacy of giving back to that. And so, you know, I wanted to dedicate my life by the time I was leaving to go to Stanford to trying to make change. And, you know, I tried to track down Marty Friedman and the people who helped my family move into this town. And Marty was dead. The head of the Fair Housing Council from the 60s is still the head of the Fair Housing Council. She's 91 years old, Miss Lee Porter. And this is the power of one person. I asked her, well, who are the rest of the lawyers that helped, and why would they do this? And she sent me to the one lawyer still alive who was organizing the other lawyers. And I asked him, well, why would you make this decision? And he said, look, I made the decision because I was sitting on my couch in the 1960s watching TV, and I saw these people trying to march in the counties I visited on this environmental justice tour, Lowndes County, where they still have so many of their residents. We talk about neglected tropical diseases. I found out, meeting with Dr. Peter Hotez, expert on neglected tropical diseases, because I'm the ranking member of the Africa subcommittee, and he said, well, Cory, these neglected tropical diseases exist in America, and most doctors don't know that. 12 million Americans have diseases that they think are only existing in Africa or South America. In Lowndes County, where civil rights marches marched from Selma to Montgomery, the lawyer that got my family into the town I grew up in broke through the walls of segregation that still plague our country. He said he was motivated because he was sitting comfortably on his couch and saw in Lowndes County these people trying to march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and was so moved by the violence that they experienced that he got up the next day, went to work, told his partner, we're busy as heck, we're just starting this business, we got to do something for this larger cause of our country. And it's amazing to me that activists in Alabama, their love and patriotism to change this country and make it more just, changed the opinion instantaneously of a lawyer in New Jersey who would then go change generations yet unborn. And so for me now, I'm the senator from New Jersey, but the problems in Lowndes County, the problems in Alabama, the problems in Louisiana, the problems in New Jersey are all the same. And for me, the way to pay back the fights for civil rights are now in a nation that has so many poor people struggling with environmental issues that are such a threat to our public health in this country. This to me it gives me a chance to try to pay forward all that was given to me.
So let's touch base just. Before we move on to one more question, I want to just touch base on a bunch of issues you've raised.
Please.
One, The issue of soil, planting, etc. Modern technology allows us, with hydro farming, 2 of the leading firms in the world are here, to be able to farm in a warehouse, have 20 different crops that you can harvest, substantially more. So technology has a promise.
Arrow Farms in Newark, New Jersey. It's amazing. In a warehouse, hydroponics, vertical farming.
And so we've brought the leaders in the world here for that. Second, Amazon technology and others delivering food to these food deserts that you spoke about. 3, shining a light of these issues that you have done today. And I think back, a decade ago when we were giving these educator awards in Newark together.
Yes.
That time. But one of the things that we've focused on is this dramatic change in the food chain, the sequencing of your microbiome and these other issues. After you completed your career as tight end for Stanford, how long before you became a vegetarian?
So it was, I'm a vegan now, and how do you know if somebody's a vegan? How do you know if somebody's a vegan? Don't worry, they'll tell you. So I left Stanford playing football. I went and played varsity sports at Oxford, and I decided to start experimenting with my body. And I said, okay, I'm going to try this vegetarian thing for 6 months. After the first month, I said, I am never going back. I felt like my body was supercharged. Some of my greatest heroes from the Olympics, like Edwin Moses, those of you might remember him, great 400 intermediate hurler, was a vegetarian.
The greatest.
The greatest, right? Yes, of all time. And then I just started making the mistake of getting rid of the illusions and starting to read about our food systems. And we live in a nation, you're talking about all these innovations in farming. There's about to be a farm bill that's about to come to the Senate. And it is shameful. We are subsidizing the very things that make us sick. So we pay twice, billions of dollars in subsidies. And then we have kids like in Newark who can go to a bodega and get a Twinkie product cheaper than an apple because of our taxpayer dollars. And then we're now subsidizing and paying for their medical care. But it's worse than that. Most people think of when they're eating in America, they have this pastoral vision. Even in the products we buy, these beautiful images they put on the packaging. But I've sat in Duplin County, in pig country in North Carolina, poor African American communities. And I've seen what pig farming is today. These massive concentrated animal feeding operations, these massive CAFOs, millions of pigs with grates where their feces falls through the cracks, goes into these massive lagoons. Pigs produce 10 times the excrement that human beings do. Same number of pigs in North Carolina as there are people in New Jersey, but they don't treat this stuff. They put it in massive lagoons. They spray it over fields untreated. I stood there with activists and watched the stench in the air, watching the mist of the stuff carry off of the spray fields and into communities, sitting with activists, poor folks who can't sell their land anymore because you have, in this case, a major Chinese company producing pigs for export. We're not even eating that pork here, much of that pork here. And what are these communities having to deal with? They can't open their windows. They can't open they can't run their air conditionings. They can't hang stuff on their lines. They can't sell their land. They can't plant in their soil. They have respiratory diseases off the charts, cancers off the charts, all because of our industrial animal agriculture that is hurting our environment, causing more greenhouse gases than the transportation industry. And we don't have conversations about how these broken food systems that we subsidize are making us sick, hurting communities, destroying our land, polluting our rivers, and we're not creating systems that really support health and well-being. And not only that, but even the farmers who are working on these pig farms who are stuck in these contracts that just don't work for them and their families. And so to me, I don't understand how we're silent about all of this injustice going on in our country. And I'm just trying to do my best, and I don't do well at it. I'm just trying to do my best to live in accordance to my values, to think about the most powerful voting we do. All of us as citizens is not at the ballot box. It's how we vote with our dollars, what we choose to buy, what we choose to support. And when it comes to food, this is why the innovations you're talking about are so urgent. If we are going to save the environment of this planet, if we are going to save the health of this planet, the points that we should be focusing on the debates is not the healthcare system. I have very strong beliefs about Medicaid, Medicare, and all the healthcare system. But really what we should be focusing on is food systems and focusing on preventative health care and making sure people aren't getting sick in the first place. And we're just not doing a good enough job of that as a country.
So, Senator, today, tonight, tomorrow, 700 of the leaders in this country are here. Companies like Purdue that have eliminated antibiotics from their chickens, etc. We have numerous of companies here, small innovative companies, creating new foods. Before I came here, I stopped in at Fat Burger in Los Angeles that starting a few days ago, got the delivery of Impossible Foods. And so it tastes the same, it looks the same.
It bleeds like a burger.
It bleeds the same. And it's kind of amazing and it is fantastic. But the movement is starting here and we appreciate your call to action.
I appreciate the difference you are making as an American citizen through your foundation. And you and I have had these conversations now for years and years and years. Alice Walker said the most common way we give up our power is not realizing we have it in the first place. All of us have the power to transform our communities. Like that one lawyer in my life, you're definitely one of these people who's standing up, using your power to transform our nation. And I believe that there's nothing that's wrong with America, as a leader before me said, that can't be fixed with what's right with America, and you give me hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and Senator. Stay here 1 second. So, Senator Booker is also the poster boy of the vegan in America today.
Sadly, they have vegan ice cream.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And, I would be remiss to say, because despite what people say about Washington, there's a lot of great friendships going on across the aisle. The guy that's coming up here now, who's in much better shape than I am, even though he eats a lot of meat, even though he comes from a state that doesn't have as good football as Stanford does. The truth of the matter is, truly one of the more honorable men in all of Washington, D.C. is Ben Sasse, so I'm glad to see him here too as well. Thank you.
And so I'd like to call up Senator Sasse now and see if he could join us up here. Thank you, Senator Booker.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Senator. Which side do you want?
You're in charge, but
no,
I'm
yours,
I'm usually on the right, but I'm easy. I'll take Cory's
You got
seat.
it. Let's switch.
I gotta say, I think a lot of Booker, and we're at events together often. I've never heard that 4-0 and 1600 joke. That's pretty good stuff. Nebraska's the winningest team in the last 50 years. Stanford's like 13th, but whatever. We were really good from 50 years ago till like 17 years ago, and we're not counting anymore. See you, Cory.
Well, tell us a little bit to start about your day today.
I had ugly flights last night, but I'm a farm kid by background, so we don't complain. I did planes, trains, and automobiles overnight. So I have 16-year-old girl, 13-year-old girl, 6-year-old boy. We live in Nebraska in a farm town about an hour outside of Omaha, and the family, I'm one of 5 people in the U.S. Senate who's never been a politician before. I was elected in 2014, and we do a family commute, which is, we're the only people who do that, and usually if you're the only person doing something, it means you're a rookie and you're an idiot. That's probably true. So the family has been coming out here spring of 15, 16, 17 for about 3 months a year, and then the other 9 months I commute every week, and about 60% of the time I bring one of my kids with me. And I get home on Friday night, and my wife tells me who annoyed her most that week, and they become my date for the next week.
So you have had quite an education. You probably have as many degrees as anyone in this room. Tell us your focus on education and what drove you.
Well, my mom's way of saying it is I'm intellectually promiscuous and can't keep a job. So I don't think my educational track is anything you should emulate. I have a history PhD from Yale, and that means that you have like a 2.2% chance of ever being employed again. So you shouldn't do that. That's the first thing to say. But I'm a strategy consultant by background, so most of my work history is McKinsey and BCG and a little bit of private equity. And I just happened to, Cory's a couple years older than I am, but I graduated undergrad in '94, and the internet was blowing up sector after sector at that point. And I quickly learned by accident, I didn't have a theory for this in my head, but Max Weber has that distinction between entrepreneurial management and bureaucratic management. And I discovered that impatience, which I'd always thought of as a vice in my life, is also a bit of a virtue. And at a time when the internet was blowing up business after business after business, I had sort of a value to add as an entrepreneurial manager. So I went into a lot of places that were blowing up. And it turned out there was probably an infinite amount of work in 3 to 6 month turnarounds when the internet was going to destroy all these business models. And I wanted to have some geographic anchor, and there was a whole bunch of stuff that I hadn't read as an undergrad and wanted to read. So I went to grad school by accident. I went because I wanted to, not because I wanted to write the great dissertation or because I wanted to be an academic, but because I wanted to be competent to teach general exam. I wanted to take general exams to be able to teach undergraduate survey courses as an avocation. I never really was planning to be an academic. And then because of my turnaround work history, I ended up becoming a college president 5 years ago, 5 years before I ran for the Senate. And so I think that the higher ed space, and I'll stop here lest I give too much of a monologue, but I think that higher ed is a sector that is ripe for just being completely blown up. We need lots more plural models of not just how we spend 18 to 24-year-old time, but how we spend 40 and 45 and 50-year-old time in a world where work duration, average duration at a firm is going to get shorter, I think, forevermore in human history, and we're going to create a world where 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds are disintermediated, not just out of a job in a firm, but out of an entire industry and skill set. And never before have 45 and 50-year-olds who got disintermediated really on a mass level got employed again. And I think we're going to have to solve the problem of lifelong learning, and no civilization has ever done that before. So we need a mass pluralization of tertiary institutions. We need lots of different forms of higher ed.
So we have a group here today. So we have a group that's been assembled that are seeing that disintermediation in the medical area, medical research, healthcare, data, sequencing the microbiome, biome, and so on. And how do you view this explosion of data disrupting various sectors, including healthcare? What advice would you give to this group today? I
mean, you all are experts in the many, many subfields that we sort of batch as healthcare, and they're really, healthcare is the largest sector of US GDP, but if you disaggregate the big five, hospitals, insurers, med device, medical specialties, and pharma, I think all five of you are sort of among the 12 to 15 largest industries in America, so we need to think more plural. I think the old anecdote that a lot of us learned in junior high, that people from Atlanta only know one word for snow, and Eskimos in Alaska have 39 words for snow. It turns out that's probably not true, but differentiation in the way we see things, I think in your sector certainly requires that, but you all are experts in the many, many subfields, and I'm not at all. But I would say that big data needs to remake healthcare, and ultimately, lots of the political debates that we're having right now, we pretend they're about federal versus state regulation or sort of level of government economic expenditure at the actual health delivery moment. I think one of the meta ways to think about the fight we're having is big data ultimately going to reside in Silicon Valley or Baltimore? Baltimore's my shorthand for CMS headquarters. And if it's Baltimore, it's going to be really, really ugly. We're not going to get higher quality, lower cost care fast enough if Baltimore owns the data. We need patients to own the data, and we need Silicon Valley to serve patients, and we need a decentralized approach to the way data pulls through all of your different subsectors. And I think Baltimore is a disastrous shorthand for East Berlin 1976. And you're never going to solve the level of problems we need if we think the federal government can own the data top down. And so I want to see data disrupt lots of your subsectors, and we need to figure out a way to create data pulls, not just data pushes from CMS, because it's going to be too slow that way.
Senator, one of the quotes I read by you.
That was supposed to get applause, by the way.
Okay.
I'm teasing.
Senator, one of the quotes I read, it wasn't until I started to learn Spanish that I understood English at all. And I think that's what travel's about. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think the quote's attributed to lots of people, but one of them is C.S. Lewis, who would say that a fish can't explain to you what water's like because he's never not been in water, right? Fundamentally, there are lots of good reasons to learn foreign language, but the most basic reason to learn foreign language is that you don't understand grammar and syntax and vocabulary in your own language until you can get out of your language and look back on it. And so even if you never use your Spanish or your French or your German or your Mandarin or your Latin, knowing another language changes you because you now see the choices that English makes, right? English is a weird language. It has a German chassis and it has a French Latin vocabulary, and that's a pretty good blessing. Like we benefit in our culture from having a language that has some of the benefits of German, but the plural language is the vocab that comes from Romance languages. I think that we need our kids to understand that a huge part of the old, what used to be called the trivium in the medieval era, grammar, logic, or dialectic, and rhetoric, right? Every discipline, every field has a grammar. And first you need to just learn basic facts. And it turns out if you have kids or grandkids that are 4 or 6 or 8, they're in the back of the car just like a poll parrot, just babbling all the time. And it's annoying as can be to a mom and dad or grandma and grandpa, but they're built to learn grammar. And once you learn your grammar, you start to figure out how to put it together and wrestle and manufacture arguments, so logic or dialectic. And then you go through puberty and all of a sudden you're a romantic poet and you want to tell stories about everything and you start to think about presentation and you're separating from mom and the household of origin. And I think we need our kids to be able to think about almost every discipline that way. And so I use the travel opportunity of the moment we live at. Think Tom Friedman, World is Flat on Speed. Middle-class people across the world can now experience the whole world in ways that would have been inconceivable for all of human history until a couple decades ago. And so I think that travel is a pretty special way to think about learning empathy and comparative X, Y, and Z disciplines, and it's akin to learning a language.
So we heard a little bit of that college president there in that.
Sorry, my bad.
So one of the issues.
I didn't ask you for money yet. That's all a college president really does.
I'm ready.
Feels like there are too many iPhones rolling, so later.
The theme this year for the Milken Institute has been building meaningful lives. And the challenge, when we see that 1 in 5, 1 in 6 men have actually dropped out of the workforce, they're not trying to get jobs today. And one of the issues we're going to address tomorrow is opioids, and 50% of those are on some drug, and 2/3 of those are on opioids. When we go back to talking about school, our college texts, and think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and what those levels are and the challenges for so many people at the bottom of our pyramid here today. It made me really think here, when you mentioned Tom Friedman, his new book, Thank You for Being Late. When he interviewed the Surgeon General said the #1 disease in America today is isolation. It's not diabetes, it's not cancer, but it's isolation. So I found that interesting. Here's another quote by Senator Ben Sasse. One of the most basic things that makes you happy in life is thinking that you're needed. If you think that your work matters to somebody, if you have a meaningful way to contribute to your neighbor, you're basically going to be happy. And I think this is the idea. How do people find meaning for life? What drove you to talk about this issue?
Yeah, so first of all, well framed on getting from opioids back to sort of vocation, because I think that too often we're chasing the tail on things that are largely symptomatic. There's all sorts of really big and important problems to talk about how we got to the opioid crisis with the potency of the stuff we're dealing with, overprescribing, et cetera, but I'm glad that you put it in this broader context. I've become a student, so business strategy guy by work history, but a historian by training, so I've never read a ton of social science. I mean, I did college economics like everybody else, but I've become a student recently of the happiness literature, and it's sort of the mirror image of it is the loneliness and isolation literature. And there is just an unbelievable amount of data over the last decade about the basic things that drive human happiness. And it's not a real question for the audience, but a rhetorical question. How many variables do you think go into the equation of whether or not you're happy? It turns out there are 4 or 5, depending on how you want to count. The first time I was asked this question, Arthur Brooks, who runs the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank here in town, who has a book, The Conservative Heart, he's really into the happiness literature. And the first time he asked me about this, I figured, well, I guess the equation has 400 inputs, but since you ask it that way, I think it's a leading question. Maybe it's 80. And it's 4, right? Besides your DNA, so the University of Minnesota has this twins literature on 300 identical twins that were separated at birth. Turns out half of whether or not you're happy or predisposed to unhappiness in life is mom's fault. So it's about half of it is in your genes. But of anything that you can control, there are only 4 variables. And they are, do you have a family? Do you have friends? And I don't mean Senate kind of friends. Actually, Cory really is my friend, but I don't mean this sort of, oh, my good friend, as you're about to rip somebody's head off in a debate and completely distort their position. And I don't mean social media friends, Facebook friends. I mean Aristotelian friends. Is there somebody who feels pain when you're hurting? And is there someone who takes pleasure when you're happy, not because they choose to, but because they love you? It's the way we feel about our kids, right? When my 16 or 13-year-old girls are hurting, I hurt. I'm not making a choice to hurt. They're just a part of me, right? And I ache. When my 6-year-old boy is flying on his bike and he's just smiling ear to ear, I look up at the sun and I feel my chest expands and I'm happy, right? Real Aristotelian friendship. Number 2. Number 3, do you have a theological or philosophical worldview to make sense of death and suffering, right? We're all scared of mortality and hiding from it 97% of the time. And number 4, and in the data, by far the largest statistical driver of happiness is meaningful work. The data is really extraordinary on this. When you leave home on Monday morning or whatever moment you begin your work week, if you think that you're needed, not do I think I make enough money, not is there some jackwagon who talks too loudly 3 cubicles away, not do my ankles or my knees or my back hurt at the end of the day, but do I think I matter? Am I needed at work? If yes, you're almost certainly going to be happy. And if no, you're almost certainly not going to be happy. It's extraordinary data that having vocation, having a calling, having meaningful work, and it's not necessarily the thing you get paid for, it's plural callings, right? Next week is the 500th anniversary of Luther and Wittenberg, so we should all sort of pause and do our liberal arts history on the word vocation. It's recitation in Western Civ. But do you have a sense of calling and meaning? If so, you're going to be happy. And I think we're going through arguably one of the biggest transformations in all of economic history. And it's usually not a historian's job to claim massive discontinuity. A historian's job is to be boring and preach continuity when everybody else thinks everything's changing. No, everything's mostly the same. You're just a narcissist and you're here. That's why you think there's tons of change right now, right? That's a historian's job. But in this case, I really do believe we're going through a transition from, you had hunter-gatherers, then you had the shift to agrarianism 10, 11,000 years ago. 150 plus years ago, we had the shift from mostly agrarian jobs. 86% of Americans live and work on the farm at the end of the Civil War. 60% of Americans lived and worked in cities by World War II. Think of that transformation. 86% on the farm, 1865. 60% working in cities by 1940. That's the third transition in economic history. What we're going through now, I think, we don't have any alphabets when hunter-gatherers settled down, so it was pretty disruptive, but we don't know. This moment that we're going through now is the biggest, and by this moment, I don't mean 2016, 17, or 2008 economic downturn. I mean the last 20 years and the next 50 to 100. We're going through a world where most people had lifelong employment for all of human history past, and hunter-gatherers and farmers didn't even have job choice. Only industrialization brought lots of specialization and lots of job choice. What we're going through now is going to be the first multi-career lives, and everybody's going to enter that world. And what that means is you have multiple moments in life, not just your adolescence, when you go through a disruption that may unsettle your work, and you may not find meaningful work again. And so I think this crisis of loneliness and isolation is about the breakdown of mediating institutions and local community, because local community has always tracked with workplaces, and that's probably not going to be the case anymore. And we're going to need 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds to figure out how to find meaningful work again. And no one in human history has ever done that before. And we're doomed if we don't solve the problem. And it's a giant, giant problem. We don't even know how to talk about it.
Well, I think, Senator, you've outlined the issue on why many of us are here. And this is the search for meaningful life. A decade ago, we put out a report called An Unhealthy America. And what really shocked me in it wasn't that America had gained all this weight and we were the heaviest country, and obesity was maybe the leading cause of medical costs today. But the number one part of that was depression. And it was absenteeism, it was presenteeism, and when we survey young people, and I want to get to that area in closing here, they are very focused on meaning and purpose, not pay. And when we survey people, what is the most important thing about their job? The answer, their co-workers. Who are the people they're working with today? And I know you have studied so many of these issues, and I want to touch on the vanishing American adult for a moment, if we could. Tell us what drove you to write this book.
So I became a college president 8 years ago, and I was leading a turnaround. And I wasn't going there because I was primarily, nobody thought I was an expert on student culture and student affairs, right? We had a financial crisis and a student recruiting crisis, and we had donor problems and X, Y, and Z. But inside the student affairs function, that wasn't why I was called there. And I found that 6 or 12 or 18 months into the job, I was 37 at the time, right? So I was regularly confused with being an undergrad.
And you didn't know that no good deed goes unpunished when you took that job, right?
That is true. It turns out that's applicable in lots of domains. But I found that what I was losing sleep about 6 and 12 and 18 months into the job was that I didn't think, even though I was 37, so I was whatever, 18, 19 years from having gone off to college myself, I didn't feel like I really understood the incoming students to our school because of one fundamental difference. I want to be clear, The Vanishing American Adult is not, an old guy screaming, "Get off my lawn." Right? This is not a what's the matter with kids today kind of book. It is that we have a new thing developing amongst us, and we don't have categories to reflect on it, and that is the emergence of this category of perpetual adolescence. So adolescence, as I define it, is a great, great thing. Perpetual adolescence is a disaster. So let's start with the good thing. Adolescence is a concept that's probably only about 2 millennia old, and it's where you create a kind of greenhouse safe space between childhood and adulthood. Throughout most of human history, puberty defines the line between childhood and adulthood, and you have to become an adult in every way when your body is an adult. That's what happened most places. If you don't have enough food, and you're not sure you got enough storehouses, and this harvest might not be great, and people might starve in your community, or you got a neighboring tribe that wants to go to war with your people, if you get an adult body, you're needed, and you're pressed into full-time work. So the distinction between childhood and adulthood is dependency and the ability to be independent. And if you can be independent, you got to do it in every way. Morally, you got to consider yourself fully formed. You can't reflect anymore after you're 12, 13, 14. Puberty now is 13, 12, used to be 14, 15. Economically, you got to form your own household. You got to fully contribute. Household formation, marriage, procreation, school leaving, full-time working, that's what happened at the moment that you hit puberty. Adolescence is this idea that we should take 12 18 months to 4 years and provide this safe space where I'm critical of the safe space movement at our college and university because these people are now 7 and 8 years into adult bodies. But the safe space movement, as it was sort of understood at the original adolescent moment, was we're going to create a space where just because you hit puberty, you don't have to be done learning. You don't have to pretend you're morally fully formed. You don't get pushed out of the nest and the household completely. You don't have to go to full-time work. All sorts of wonderful things where we protect this space as long as we understand that it's a means to an end, right? Adolescence is a means to becoming an adult. It should not be your destiny. We kind of forget that Peter Pan, Disney has sort of tried to freshen it up and make it seem like it's glorious to have this fountain of youth as a 14-year-old. Peter Pan is a dystopian hell. If you go back and read the book, the guy's 30 and he's killing people, right? And he doesn't have any memory. He lives in the moment. He just cuts somebody's head off and then the next day he doesn't remember their name, right? Like, it is a bad thing to be stuck in a Peter Pan world. And we are accidentally sort of consigning lots of our kids at 18 and 20 and 22 and 24 to still acting like they're 13. And so it's increasingly difficult to tell 10 and 15 and 20 and 25-year-olds apart. And I think the root of this is that we're the richest people in all of human history. And because of that, we don't really need our kids. And so I didn't mean to intentionally draw this back to your point about work. But our kids, when they're 10 and 12 and 14 and 16, we certainly don't need them economically. And that's really new in human history. As recently as the end of the US Civil War, most economic historians estimate more than 30% of the value of a household was added by pre-adolescent kids. Under 14-year-old kids added 30% of the value to your household until 150 years ago. And that meant that you had this transition from 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 to 16 where you were progressively more needed and you learned to work. We don't now have in our kids' bellies, in their experience, they don't know the distinction between production and consumption. They mostly know a distinction between progression through years in school, which can be useful, but it's not an unmitigated good. School is not a sufficient substitute for all productive categories that exist. And so we need to think of education as the end and school as a tool, a really important tool, but a tool that we ought to be able to be reflective on. And our kids, they have time in school, and then they have different consumption categories. And that leads to a world where they don't only not know the difference between production and consumption, they tend to not know a real distinction between needs and wants, and we're not serving them well. The Vanishing American Adult is 2/3 constructive, only 1/3 critique. There's no blame laying in the book, but if there were, I'm laying it on us, not on the adolescents. It's that we haven't reflected on a world where kids are coming of age without any engagement with a productive environment, and we can and need to do better for them than that.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. And one of the themes that we constantly, and our president, Rich Ditizio, started out with this issue. You think you might be trying to solve a problem here, but it results in something else. So the extension of life, the improvement of quality of life, technology today has made a lot of challenges as young adults grow up, and the challenges, and when we appreciate the path you've taken and we appreciate the history lesson tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.